Welcome to Our Present Future, Explorations in Regeneration. This episode is with Nuno de Silva and Constança Belchior. Nuno and Constança are the co-founders of Lúcida, an organization dedicated to supporting the deep change processes that are involved in integrating and working within a living systems vision. Both Nuno and Constança have quite diverse backgrounds and experiences from a range of industries, including science, economics, development, policy, among others, which gives them both quite unique perspectives on how to enliven regenerative values in existing communities and organizational cultures. In this conversation, we discuss some of the sensitivities around language and framing in conversations about regeneration and sustainability, about how expectations are set by different narratives, and we reflect on how to navigate the intention to hold both meaningful and accessible spaces for transformation. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Nuno de Silva and Constança Belchior. Nuno, Constança, welcome and thank you very much for joining me. I'm very excited to have this conversation, and we have no shortage of interesting topics to go into, but we chose to focus today on the complexity and importance of language and framing around sustainability, around regeneration, the tensions that can arise with greenwashing, and we'll get into all that. But first, I wanted to start and ask you to please introduce yourself and your work.
Yeah, thanks, Jay, for having us. So my name is Constança. I am from Lisbon. That's where I am right now. I think where I would like to start by saying what, a little bit of me is my background in biology, because I think marine biology, because I think that informed the way I look at life and I look at the world. And I think now that I'm doing something else that really stands out. So I've worked a lot in the field around science and policy, environmental policy, trying to bring that sort of understanding of life and the science behind it and all the data indicators of marine ecosystems and the impact of human activities, all of that into policy. And then basically after doing 10 years of that, I realized that we might have been doing or gaining incremental gains, actually change in terms of some of the indicators around pollution or around habitat destruction or, biodiversity, not really, but some, environmental indicators are getting a little bit better in the short term, but then the longer term, the systemic views of all of these interacting forces was not working. And so I left that field asking so there's some deep transformational change that we as humans have to do on this planet. And it's not in the science policy world that I'm going to find how to do that. And that led me through, big 5 years of exploration, actually, and around leadership, around creativity, around facilitation. So very much how do we work collectively, which brought me to regenerative development, which I'm sure we'll get into. And in that process, I met Nuno. And then I think we all went through this transformational process with the regenerative development field. And we somehow, what emerged is that we had to work together. And that offspring a few years later, 2 years now, is Lúcida, which is our organization that is really aimed at managing, helping, supporting change processes, change management, so that that change actually leads to systemic effects that really integrate people, planet, society. So very much with this regenerative thinking into it. So I'll pause there and pass on to Nuno.
I always love to hear your story. Every time there's a little detail that changes, or it's strange to talk about us. I was listening to Constança and trying to think where to start. I've always been kind of curious, and one of the things that I kind of realized throughout my life is, as many people around me usually come at discussions or conversations full of certainties, and I always been like a bit that kind of guy that is listening and kind of building ideas or building my own thinking. So I've always been questioning a lot. So I've studied, my background is in economics, and economics was kind of a really painful experience going through university. Firstly, because it didn't make sense the way we were learning, and when you go into economics, if you are a questioning mind, it's very hard because the way economy is taught around the world is pretty much the same. So it's a very narrow perspective of what economy is and what kind of economic thinking goes behind it. In that time, I was involved already in youth organizations, doing a lot of things with citizenship, participation, intercultural learning, human rights, peace education. So after 1.5 years working in the private sector, I just turned my back on it and went to work fully in the civil society field, with network of youth organizations around Europe, North Africa, Middle East, with a question on my background, which is like, we are not learning what we need to learn to be able to cope with the world of the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. So what kind of capabilities, capacities we need to develop, and how to develop them was a big question mark for me. And going through the civil society work with youth organizations and working with what we call in Europe non-formal education, I discovered there's really amazing ways to engage young people in learning adventures, journeys, peer-to-peer learning in a way that is much more engaging and coming from their own interests, and helping them build their capacity to understand the world, make sense of it, and act in it. So that was my journey, like from the first decade of professional decade, and then I went to work with the World Bank and the Ministry of Education in Timor, and that's what was kind of the final dramatic change for me, because after that, I really questioned the model of development that the Western world is kind of exporting to the rest of the world. And I came back to Europe in 2014, really in a place of, the way I've been thinking about education is not enough. There's something more we need to be doing. So I went into a long journey of discovery, working with permaculture, systems thinking, started to do theory U hubs in the south of Portugal. So really looking for different ways to integrate individual and collective, inner and outer work. And when I made the course with Constança of regenerative development in 2020, was really, I would say, the end of a cycle of saying, I found my home, and now I'm going to move in this direction of working with regeneration and regenerative development, because it's a practice that in a way invites me to embody and incorporate, integrate everything I've been doing until now. So I guess one of the things that we have in common, it's in our DNA, me and Constança, is this sense of being willing to get out of our comfort zones, not get attached to, habitual ways of thinking and doing things, and to institutions or a certain professional career, and really go after what it's in our hearts, what's deeply in our souls, calling us to do in the world, and doing that stretch, because it requires a stretch in us to keep questioning ourselves, questioning the world around, and really being developing that elasticity, that muscle to go and take risks and explore the unknown, the not knowing, and be comfortable in that place, or find some comfort. It's never totally comfortable, but at least find some comforts and some way to continually re-energize ourselves. And I think this is something that might resound a lot in you also, from what I know from you, Jay.
Yeah, wonderful. Oh, thanks. I've got like three different top questions bubbling through my mind listening to both of you. I'd love to start with this point that you just mentioned, Nuno, about this continual stretch. And I think this relates to framing and to language, but it's more on a personal level. And it's about expectations and expectations that reside within a paradigm or within a culture. So perhaps, Constanza, in the scientific community, I wonder if when you realized actually this is incremental, it's helpful, but perhaps it's not significant enough, were there windows or doors that you felt maybe we could make a wedge and grow in here? Or was it like, we think this way and we're happy with this, and even bringing that question was shut down? And yeah, sort of how have you seen the sort of immune system of the cultures that you've been, having your journeys going through? What are the expectations of these cultures?
Interesting. Yeah, I guess in a way, I left that science policy world because I got to those limits. I did explore them as much as possible. And I must admit that it also depends on where you are, of course, exploring these avenues. So my last workplace was the European Environment Agency. And I must admit that I think as an institution, a formal institution, an EU institution, it was also part of its remit. It was really to explore, to give the what they would call like the rock solid knowledge base, knowledge coming from a kind of a stream from data to information to then knowledge. So there was a lot of, I think, subjectivity that was invited to that space, and that meant also like these questions that one could have, right? So okay, so what do it look like to support policies where you're trying to look into the systemic effects, you're trying to look into something that's much more complex that right now doesn't really fit in an indicator or a report or something. So I was very blessed to work in that space that allowed a lot of exploration, and yet it still had its limits because it has a certain remit, and it was at the edge. So I think for me was, and also from my experience there, even within the commission and etc., there's a lot of people that are thinking, having these questions, holding these questions, trying to challenge the expectations that a certain culture has, namely the policy one also has huge ones. What was missing, I guess, was this process of bringing what's at the edge to the core and allowing it to kind of really shake the core. And I would say maybe, things do pick up. So today, systems change, for example, is something that's really, that's all over, right? But I mean, in terms of language as well, what is this like? What do we mean by system change, right? What do we mean by system thinking? Is it just putting more things together and then, integrating them somehow? Or is it like what this regenerative space really asks of us, which is, how is that then, like, what is the sense making I'm doing? How is that challenging my own belief system, my own worldview, and then that of my culture, of my institution? Is that serving what we're seeing the world, observing the world, sensing in the world? So that sort of deep questioning, that didn't happen. Not in the core, So there just felt like that immune system is at the core, not at the edges, It's just how to bring that into the core and allow those spaces of transformation to happen.
Do you think that that sort of at that core of the culture, that we must have, data hypothesis, there's these core patterns of the scientific method. Do you think that could be redirected to embrace a broader living systems worldview? Or do you think there's something fundamentally missing in that sort of core approach?
No, I mean, then you also need rigor. I think that's the other thing. And I think what the scientific approach brings is a method, a rigorous method of testing things out and seeing if there's truth in it, and also like a temporary truth to it. I think the way that society has co-opted science as if they're, you know, like we went from religion to science almost, and then we're putting science as in the pedestal without really challenging, okay, what's, you know, just a part of the truth. That's, I think it's how you do it. I think as a method, it's really valuable. But again, it's just one real rigorous method, normally aimed at things you can measure and observe. And there's a lot of these of the world that we're seeing these changes that need to happen, you know, belief systems, worldviews, all of this, that doesn't really have it basically requires a different way of trying to measure. I'm not going to say you cannot measure or quantify it or something, but we're not there yet. And I think that's the exploration. So it's not about the method, it's how we're using it and the importance that we're giving to it. I would say that's my view.
That makes sense.
I think the rigor, I think that's also the core of this discipline. And you do need a rigorous method to be able to, otherwise you do get lost. So to really do profound systems change, you do need to be rigorous and, you know, understand what you're observing and sharing it and allowing it for the whole peer discussion. You know, so there's a lot that we can take from that method to really be rigorous about how we're discussing this transformational processes.
Definitely. I think it ties into this notion of, Nuno, you were mentioning you observe so many people being so confident and so certain along your path, and that you kind of had this natural instinct to say, or I interpreted your description as maybe questioning that. You know, why so certain? Are we really that certain? And what would be the advice to these cultures that you've been working with in your experience to redefine their relationship with certainty? How would you propose? It's almost like we can be more confident when we embrace a little bit more humility. We can still use our methods, we can still bring rigor, but maybe we are overinterpreting or giving too much weight to some of these results. How would you elaborate or contrast on that and think about this notion in the organizations that you've been in?
Yeah, just to start, to be fair, we are hardwired to be aiming for homeostasis. So in a way, living systems are hardwired to try to maintain a certain balance in their meeting of the context, right? So that's ingrained in us, and it's also ingrained in any sorts of scales of living systems. But if you think about an organization or a community, those forces to try to keep stabilizing the system and in a way controlling it are always there, right? So there's always, you know, a part of us that resists to change. That's why often I was thinking about Constance's change when she left the institute, and then also in my own experiences turning out or turning my back to institutional spaces I was in, was this kind of awareness that this is not working anymore, and also a recognition that I don't have the capabilities now to cope with this within this context. So that's why often people turn their backs to familiar contexts and go, you know, search for new tribe, new places, new ideas, because there is a crisis, right? There's a crisis there. So I think that's something to look into, because we often think change in putting force into change. And if you look around, most of the change initiatives, they involve putting energy out in the world, doing things, moving things around. Carl Sanford says it's in a way kind of playing like pool playing. You just go with your cue and you knock on the ball to touch on that, to put the other ball on the pocket. But actually, change in nature is quite emergent. It's very hard to predict. Can happen in any kind of from anywhere. So I think it's more. I started to look like what can we nurture in ourselves and in organizations that can be conducive to cope with change in a more conscious way. So there's definitely things we can do, right? We can practice in ourselves. One is this humility we're talking about, to really be humble towards a living world that is always, kind of bringing chaos and wilderness in it. And that's also in us because we are nature. And kind of creating structures that allow us to move forward. But we have to unpack a lot of things because we've been, and I think I want to bring in is we have a culture that has been for the last 10,000 years working a lot on fixating people in territories and kind of controlling those territories for the benefit, for our benefit. So it's a lot of generations working towards management and control of ourselves and the environment around us so that it becomes something expectable. So you see a lot of the science from the last millennia, and particularly after Illuminism, has been around control and prediction, around our ability to predict the way the world is going to unfold. And we are getting more as the last century sciences of quantum physics have been emerging, we've been start to realizing that actually the world is much more, like permeable and kind of chaotic and impossible to control. So we need to work with life and the living forces in a different way, not in a way of management and control, but in a way that we work with our conscious to understand the processes and be humble because they are quite complex and one person alone cannot fully grasp what's going on around us. So how we can, being humble individually, being humble collectively, start to have conversations from a more not knowing place and questioning things, particularly our ways of thinking, because these things, these ways of thinking about ourselves and the world around are pretty much embedded in us and in the educational systems. So I was just thinking, like, imagine my generation still learn in school that, and it was my parents' message that is, if you do this path in education and you finish college, the rest of the life will be pretty much a easy script. It's going to be happy forever, good employment, a career, you get married, have kids, and that's it. But the world changed dramatically and is showing us that that kind of thinking doesn't make sense anymore. And that actually learning and keep moving ourselves as the world moves around us is essential to life. It's part of how life works. So that there's a lot of unpacking to do, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I think of that example a lot of the go to school, get a good job, have a family. This is like such a common default path, at least for a lot of, large part of the culture. And how much of a, recalibration that people need to go through. It's like now enough of us know, we've gone through enough iterations that we can say, okay, raising kids and telling them that it's not going to go that way for most, right? So there's a hypocrisy built into that common frame that we know is going to lead to challenge and struggle. And I see a similar, I don't know the best way to frame it, please take it and elaborate, but a similar concern or challenge around sustainability and regeneration, and that we have so many people, so many hearts, minds, souls coming into new relationship with nature and to understand, okay, tipping points, planetary boundaries, ecology, biodiversity, climate change, all of these things, all the plastic, all of these entry points into the conversation that then each go into their sort of tunnel niche marketing. If it bleeds, it leads. The sort of sensationalism. There's a whole echo chamber and framing that onboards people in, that is going to lead to a disappointment. Is going to lead to a moment where you say, "Oh, it's more complex than I thought." And so if you're not invited to think about complexity, if you're not grounded in expectation that is going to help you weather the stretches that you mentioned in the beginning, like you're going to need constant renewal of this will and understanding. And each moment where we have a kind of worldview expansion is like, okay, wow. And that's sort of enriching, and it's like nutrition, but it's also, again, humbling. And so this is a concern of mine, is like how
the common tendencies for marketing and communication, and of course this is largely advertising driven, and the types of platforms and contexts in which this communication is being delivered, but how they frame the expectations in a way that is ultimately unserving to the long-term journey, to the long game, which is, we're in this for the long run. We got to really rewire our whole relationship with the world, and we don't really know how to do it. We got some good ideas, but we also disagree on a lot, and we're trying to figure it out. So welcome to the mess, but it feels good to be a part of it if you have the right expectation. How do these themes resonate with you, and how have you reflected on this sort of challenge of opportunity of setting good expectations for this difficult but ultimately enriching journey?
What a question, Jay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great question, because we've been struggling with that. Let's say we've been dancing with that question constantly, right, Constança?
Yeah. I mean, our very humble way of welcoming the mess and actually getting some new value from the mess that can put us on that longer transformation that you're speaking to was to create Lúcida. Mm-hmm. And which just comes down to from this deep felt sense of what I and Nuno that comes together, we saw that is needed in the world. And from our kind of own, we use the word, so I'm very mindful about the language since you put that into the space, right? But we use the word essence, but it would be something about what's that thing that you really consider, like if you really were to close your eyes and try to, if an alien would come, as Nuno many times talks about that example of aliens come and speak to us, right? If an alien would come and ask, so who are you? What would you tell that alien about yourself, And somehow that would be the essence, not just physically. But there's something about, from what we see the world needs, open, being, as we said, from our trajectory, very open to different perspectives, cultures, trying to get out of our echo chamber, as you're mentioning, but knowing that there's always an echo chamber somehow, but then also being very conscious about these different perspectives and knowing that there's truth to all of them. Yeah, reality is just too complex for one truth, again, science. So, and then from our own essence, we are, like, what is it that we can bring to the world that can help a little bit change towards that direction? And then through Lúcida, we're trying to, it's very new and it's very unknown in terms of how we can even design services that help bringing this change with more conscious looking at self, looking at the we space, and also the work that you're doing in the world to look at this as a whole, so it's not disconnected. And that means if we end up working just with one organization here in Portugal, or if it's an international network, or if it's or if it's a very local community in Sintra or in the south of the Algarve, or it doesn't really matter for us, because we don't know what the other outcomes are, right? And I think what's really important is to acknowledge that there is this larger forces like social media, all of that polarization, all of that oversimplification, just bringing in this consumerist mindset and the convenience, which I think it's a really, really also another large wave that is very not helpful to the type of deep transformation work that you need to do, because it's not convenient. You're not going to do it fast and furious. So acknowledging all of that, and at the same time creating these other spaces where you can have those conversations, where you can have those experiences, where you can have those reflections that will have, that's our belief anyway, and a little bit of our experience so far, that will have those other consequences, other shifts in the system that you don't know what they will unlock or that will transform. So for me, it's always about coming back to what you want to do. You feel that the world, that's a contribution quite unique and have to the world, and that speaks to who you want, the type of creation that you deeply want to bring into the world. And the rest is the rest. The rest is the mess.
Yes.
Well, it's actually great you brought this, Jay, because so we were talking about like there's resistance to change in every living being in a way, right? There's some energy put for conservation, for balance, for maintaining, and what we've been reflecting in Lúcida, and it's been at the center of our way of thinking about change, is that if you look at the last 30, 40 years, let's say, right? Sustainability as a word start to really show up after 92 in the first COP, and then has been slowly but very steadily building up, and now it's all over the place. But what we realize, if we observe more carefully the way sustainability as a concept and as an idea is being processed and acted upon, pretty much what we usually do is we process these ideas or these concepts with the mindset, the framing we have at the moment. We don't question the way we are thinking. We just come with this new thing and process it. So what happens is often what you call co-option, right? This kind of greenwashing that often I would say happens, a big part of it happens inconsciently, is just, our own selves not questioning things deeply and just processing things with the habitual ways. And then the outcomes are not going to be that different, So you see a lot of work of people, or especially organizations, putting sustainability out there in the way they show up, but actually they are still doing quite. They might do some incremental changes, but it's not going to be really to a whole new level. So we're going to be generating kind of similar results. So we start to look like actually we need to work on being more able to invite people to observe and question their thinking process, so that we actually start to really shift different aspects of thinking. Because one of the things, for instance, it's all over the place is we usually fall into a mechanistic, fragmented way of looking at things. Even if you talk about sustainability, circular economy, or some of the other formulas or concepts and models that are showing up, most of them, we still process them in a way that we end up looking at separate things in parts, organizing a linear process, intervening in very partial ways, which often somehow solves something concrete, but then generates all sorts of other problems in the system, other kind of feedback loop effects and all different kind of things. So that there's a way in which we really need to start to develop, and I would love to talk about that. Change our ways of thinking and develop new capacities that we need to develop. Otherwise, we'll keep on processing these ideas, and it's happening also with regeneration, with the same mindset that create them, and we're going in that way. The way we think about crisis is part of the crisis.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and also I feel so much sensitivity around how that can be productively proposed and invited. Unless somebody is already ready and interested in seeking, I would really, I've had a moment where I've been humbled, and I understand I have these thinking patterns leading me into certain perspectives. Wow, I want to expand. Great. There's a lot of good tools to receive. But if it's somebody that has life and kids and work and is overwhelmed and has this much of their attention and energy available to think about sustainability initiative X, and that they've already, feel like they're behind and they want to get something done, and then you come in and you say, well, hold on. It's actually important that you think completely differently. It may lead to some, okay, now I'm, my expectation was I could get some insight on this specific initiative, and now you're telling me I don't even see the world correctly. I'm overwhelmed, right? And so which, you can say is always good in the long run, because the more people that ask that question, great. But there's also a sensitivity on the timing and the form that they come. That may put that person off another 10 years and say, I'm so irritated with this. Whereas if they had smoother onboarding into that theme where they were really intrinsically motivated into it, it could be more fulfilling. And so it becomes very difficult to meet people where they are. Imagine a company that wants to turn their operations sustainable, but the things on their mind right now are, how do I reduce paper, and I guess I should look into carbon credits. And there's a very there's a few keywords and topics, but they're really not immersed in ecological overshoot and collapse and biodiversity and all of these nuances that would bring them into more humility about the frame, but yet they still have the intention. So how to cultivate that intention kindly and gently, while also not lying to them by letting them believe you got it, because it's like, well, really, there's a bigger conversation, but to get into that conversation, there's kind of this gate that you need to go through, this worldview perspective questioning. How do you wrestle with this? I think it connects, I'll try to summarize. I know this is a little long-winded, but I think it connects to this incremental versus disruptive innovation or change. And it's, how far is far enough, right? And so how do you meet people and help them take the first steps and take their, claim their moment on, entering their journey, but also be authentic to let them know of what comes ahead?
That's great. That's a great question. And actually it's an open inquiry, because I think that's an art. It's there's no method to it. And and it's about building with experience. So I can tell you that the first organization that we work with, we just came out of the regenerative development course, and we were humble enough by the practice, because we understood what it meant to bring about, change that is connecting yourself, your team, or your organization, plus the work that you're doing in the world. And so we were humbled, and yet we thought we could really, that we knew how to do this. And we just said huge, it was amazing. And I think we ended up bringing a lot of value for both sides. But in the end, we thought, okay, and this was, again, an organization that was already open to change. It was not like, just like, oh, no, I understand. I deeply understand the challenges in the world. And this is really about, I want this organization to have a different role. What's the role of companies in the 21st century, given the landscape? So it's, so someone pretty open, but in the end, we just thought, okay, we can do this directly. We can work with, elements of leadership. We can work with your belief system directly. We can work with all of this. And we just got a bit of backlash, which is normal, because then you get into that really uncomfortable space, and where you kind of, everything is shaken. So as you were saying, you might get into 10 years behind. That's a risk. It wasn't the case. But so I think that first experience, for me at least, it really was like, okay, wait. We had a perfect setting here, someone very open to do transformational change, and yet realizing that you cannot look at the world as if, just because I like change and I went in through this journey, and Nuno as well, that others will also kind of immediately want to do that. I think since then, that question of meeting people where are at, it's a very, and then slowly, gently, as you said, gracefully do the work. I think at least with Lúcida, what we try to, when we try to do the pattern, try to see the pattern of our approach based on that experience and the others that we had before, was a bit like we use the analogy of flirting, dating. So you don't really, once you know someone, you don't go like, okay, let's get married, have kids, live together, jump in, like that's it, share bank accounts, and let's do our will, by the way. Right? There's a moment where you just need to kind of hang out and just let your whole being kind of sense that person. And in this case, an organization or a community, and, and trying to really show you, I have the responsibility of showing up to my fullest self. so that's kind of there's the field that we're creating, the energy field, if you want, is also inviting that space for others to do that. And then it's about really deeply understanding the challenge, and not just maybe what they're saying, right? And that means that you have to get to know the person a little bit. Again, you go into the dating moment, right? You have to get to know and understand a bit the patterns of how they look at the world, how they engage with others, with their coworkers, with their families, how they see things. So you start to kind of like understand a bit more what's the challenge, what's behind that challenge, what's the real challenge, And then you put it that open, you try to, does it resonate? And then, but with that, you're kind of building that relationship, that trust, that care, and then, maybe you can start to do some work. We can bring in some of the tools that we work with, which are these dynamic frameworks that help, what Nuno was saying, to help bring more awareness to how you're thinking. What kind of elements are you putting together? What is the level of thinking, or like, is it coming from an ego perspective, or, from a more purposeful mode, for example? So you start to let the way that you work with that person, that organization, emerge from the context, from the very specific context that they're in, based on your deep understanding, deep care for that. And then, so this is like a modular approach, if you want. And then maybe there's a step where you say, okay, look, it was great, this whole dating, and I just want to be friends with you. That's fine, or like, this is not for me. Like, that's also fine. Or like, okay, let's go on a trip together, maybe, So this is very like a slow process that needs to unfold. And we just try to be ready for this unfolding, and which in the end very much comes with the quality of being that we bring to these meetings, or to these conversations, and I think it's also, you need to create a little bit, I think, of a space for people to not be in that automatic mode, So even if it's just for 1 hour, to create a field, like now we're just in this podcast, and I really feel, like we already know each other, but still it's like we have a common interest, but still it's deepening, right? There's something here that is moving us, that is making us smile, as I'm seeing Nuno and yourself. So there's something here that we can pick up, and then like from that space, is there another conversation? Is there another output? But I think the most important thing as well, and that we learn a lot with our mentors, that we're pioneering this sort of work, regenerative development, right? 30 years ago, which was even much more alien back then. I can't even imagine the struggles they had. It's an investment that you're doing in a system. So even if you only have one conversation of 30 minutes with one person, and that you think doesn't lead to anything, it might have outcomes that come back 3 years later, because that person was in a different space then, and then kind of like, oh, wow, I remember that conversation. Maybe I'm going to call, what's Constança up to now? Or Nuno, or Jay, right? So it's trusting that you're putting these out there in the system, and this information that might do something, might not do, but you're letting go of that expectation of the outcome. That's how I respond.
That's beautiful.
Wonderful. I was just wanting to acknowledge one thing I think we all kind of agree upon, that is, all that's happening now, it's happening in the context of, and you've alluded to the term culture, Jay, within cultures that I think are profoundly traumatized and have a lot of pain as a result of this mindset, and in a way it's a cycle we've been going through as humanity, this profoundly kind of coming down to a material world, and just focus on the material, focus on the individual, on the smallest unit of society, which is the person, has brought amazing changes, but also a lot of limitations. And one of the challenges that you brought that I think is quite important to recognize is that both within us and in the culture, there's a lot of aspects of our patterns of engagement that are limiting our capacity to change. The number of hours we work per day, the fact that we have, I was just think about us, like the two of us, right? Or the three of us, we are parents, We have kids, we have growing parents that need also some care. So we are in that kind of generation starts to be in the middle. And we have all this pressure in a very individual way. Well, before that would be lived in a much more communal way, with much more networks of support. Just to illustrate that kind of mindset, when I arrived in Timor-Leste, I got shocked with how much families spend money on marriages and funerals. Particularly in funerals, it's crazy. People come from all over the island to mourn with you, and they spend days in the house of the family of the relatives that died, living on their expenses. And I said, this is not sustainable. These people don't live well, and they spend all this money. This doesn't make sense from my mentality, economical mentality from the West. But obviously, if you dive a bit deeper, those are the moments that the bonds are reinforced, that really connections are built in such a strong way that they will be supporting each other throughout life, So that's something that's really important to acknowledge, that makes really the dramatic resistance to changes in the systems. So I guess one of the movements is to really start to create nurturing environments and relationships. So for instance, when we look at the client, we don't look at the client and we don't look at our services as we have something to sell and it's a transaction. And if you don't want, like this first company we worked with, they fired us a couple of times. Like they would say, okay, there's no conditions for us to do this work now with you guys, it's better we stop. And we would constantly come back and say, okay, we understand, but our commitment is to your willingness to continue this path and to believe that it's possible to be a different kind of company in the 21st century. And that's what we are of service, that you want to do this, that we believe in, and we want to help you with that. And that will not stop just because we stop working tomorrow. That will continue throughout life. So can we start to work in those ways to create this kind of relationships that are mutually supportive? So for us, for instance, when we do this work and it's very hard and it's not going to be comfortable in any time in the future, our mentors from Regenesis talk about that. So how can we build relationships of friends in the work, that we support each other? How in companies we can start to... So we had the idea with this company, we're going to do step-by-step change the whole company. Change doesn't work that way, right? So one of the key aspects of the way we're working with is each living system has a unique essence, as something unique value is bringing to the systems is engaged with, the world is part of. And in that way, that's not something fixed, right? So living beings are always in changing throughout life. So there's a developmental capacity to keep grazing our capacities to deal with the challenges and growing challenges throughout life, and be able to develop ourselves to cope with that and to generate more value for ourselves, for each other, and for the world around. So when we look at others, we start to say, like, we don't want to work with people just that are there, because what we want to start to work with is what is the persons or the organizations wanting to bring into life, and start to see their potential to develop in order to bring that to life. So we work with that space of potential of what this person can develop and can shift in her, in the way she's thinking about things, doing things, and being within that context, that if she becomes more conscious, so conscience is a big part of this, if she becomes more conscious and does those shifts, her capacity to deliver different levels of value will going to be stepping up quite considerably. So that part of essence and potential and looking as living wholes that are always changing and adapting and coping with the world around is something we work with. Obviously, it's never the same. So we always have to be engaging in this way that Constança was saying, in our full selves, trying to meet the person halfway. So one of the things we often do is we call it external considering, but basically it's putting ourselves in the other's shoes and think like, how is this CEO of the company thinking? What is the world perspective from his own, reality, from his own being, so that then we can find ways to help the person gain discernment, or the organization. And we work this together always in teams, because we are also in that process, right? So we keep ourselves in check. Otherwise, we don't fall in the trap of downloading things on people or on territories, and really working with them in a living way.
Yeah, and
it's just some more tips. Yeah,
Constança, yeah, wonderful.
If I may add a personal story of this this ability, this capacity to be in the other's shoes, and really to to work with that. One thing is to recognize that, first have to see that, and then to have it as being able to establish a process where you can really move. So my brother, he is, I would say, he views the world in a very different way than I do. I think, in a nutshell, very neoliberal, technology, all of that. And we have these territorial fights, cat and dog, about climate change, the world, and he calls me an eco terrorist and things like that. But, in a kind of a humoristic way. And so, especially when we're at lunches and things like that, right? And we have a ground rule now, which is we don't go into that space, because otherwise we end up fighting, because simply our worldviews collide, right? But then one day I really was able to understand him, because, he's a smart guy, very well educated, very well connected, so it's not like he doesn't see and understand the data. It's not, it's like, so, but I never really cared enough to understand deeply why was he kind of being that way, and not even wanting to engage in a conversation, just like pointing fingers, not even like trying to say, okay, not that step of I want to know more. Yeah, because he has kids, I'm sure he sees also his concerns about the world changing, etc. And one day we're in this lunch and we had drink a little bit, so things were a little bit more softer and all of that. So some of these defenses that we build up, like, were a little bit more loose. And he told me really with a lot of anger, meaning he cared a lot, about so you keep telling me these things about climate change and the change that we need to do and get rid of fossil fuels and this, that. Are you really deeply aware of what that means in terms of lifestyle? What that means in terms of changing lifestyle, if we were to go that way? And indeed, I understood where it was going. He really likes his life. He really likes his life. And he understands that we have to do these profound transformational shifts that will challenge our lifestyles. And he doesn't want to go that way. Fair enough.
Yeah, wow.
And I was like, from that moment on, I'm like, oh, my capacity basically to empathize with folks like him. So I also see him as a persona, right? Someone that represents the way that people think. Maybe those big companies are coming in, maybe all of this greenwashing thingy, whatever. There's an element of that which is really like they deeply understand. Everybody deeply understands, like not everybody, but most people really deeply understand. They just don't want to go there. And that's the space. Okay. One is the kind of, like the recognition part, right? You surface that out. Oh, and that's open up a field where if I was to engage with him in a different way, where if there was a little bit of opening, of course, then its family doesn't work. But, if you're in a space of a different sort of partnership, then you could work with that. But you need to create the relationship. You need to create the environment. Maybe alcohol is a part of that. I have no idea, But you need to break down barriers, basically, so that you can get to the essence of what's going on, to really the core of what's going on, and why you're afraid, and what you want to change, and all of these, what's restraining, activating you, so that you can start that process of, oh, okay, so let's accommodate that. Let's not say, no, everything will be fine in this new lifestyle. We'll love it as well. No, okay, so what about it that you don't want to lose? Maybe, and this is a guy, again, he is in the sharing economy, he's not in the whole property thing. So there's a lot that you can pick up from. So I really appreciated that moment. It was like, wow, okay.
That's a wonderful story. Ladies and gentlemen who are hearing us, a disclosure, in Lúcida, we don't use alcohol to change people's mindsets. Okay. No, but it's great you're pointing also, Constança, because in a way it's part of how our work has been shifting is we don't think that, for instance, working with regeneration or is about going out there trying to convince others. And we realize also that there's many ways to work around change and coping with the current situation we are in and this big transformation we are going through, right? So one of the things we often observe is people arguing with each other, what's right or wrong, or this is the right way to go for change or that. We are often caught up in this reactive mode. And I guess what Constança was saying, I can have that experience in my family. There's all these trigger things, topics and things that generate reaction within the family dynamics, right? And we have that in social contexts, and you see in social media how much is feeding on reactivity. And so there's a problem. If we keep just looking at what is generating the reactivity on a surface level, which is apparently the contradiction of worldviews, we are not really creating the ground for change, because it's going to be like this, right? Us and them against one against the other, and we see that polarization dynamic going around very strongly. So our work is in a way, and what we are trying to kind of work with people is develop their capacity to develop conscience in a way that they can understand what are the deeper patterns that are sourcing that reactivity. For instance, her brother, Constance's brother, was reactive because he was trying to protect his way of living and, in a way, his expectations of how life should be. So can we, instead of working reactively, start to acknowledge that and then see what we can work together to work in that in a more purposeful way? Because it might be that we are able to protect some aspects that are really fundamental of our living lifestyles and the way we want to live life with the kind of change you want to produce. But if we just keep discussing on the surface, we're never going to really have the conversations that are necessary to have to reconcile this. So this is a great example of how we can start to work on really acknowledging it's not about being right or wrong, like Rumi said. There's a place out there beyond right and wrong. Let's meet there. And I guess that's the invitation we need to do to each other right now. Instead of getting in the right or wrong, who is doing the best work, who is doing the wrong work, what is regeneration, what is not. We just came from a meeting in Mallorca where that kind of setting was taking place, and acknowledging doesn't make sense to discuss who's right or wrong. Each one of us has a different calling, a different role to take in this. Can we support each other and continue to question ourselves, question each other in a healthy way, but in a supportive way? It's hard to do what we have to do all together. And the fact is, we don't know how to do it collectively and individually, so we need to really be humble and support each other. We're going to fail tremendously every day. We're going to fail somehow on something, and can we be gentle, delicate, and support each other? I guess that's what I'm feeling. This sense of love and work with being to being with each other, instead of just this kind of woke culture, right? That this is the right thing and you're wrong, and all these backlashes that you have on social media that waste so much energy.
Yeah. And Jay, maybe I'll just put one question that might, or one approach that might be useful for your listeners is, as we are, what Nuno said is easier said than done, right? But then maybe one way to approach these conflicts of opinion, of perspective, of worldviews is to hold this question of what is right about A, B, C. What is right about the neoliberal perspective? What is right about climate change advocates? What is right about LGBTQA+? What is right about white superiority? I mean, and these are difficult questions, but the thing is, that puts us in a mindset of trying to see not what's wrong about the other one, like what is that element that might be right, and I want to explore further. So going in that place of not knowing, right? I think that is a good question to face these differences in the world and see if they put you in that other space of inquiry.
That's great. Thank you. I think it's very common to intellectually value, oh yeah, let's empathize, but how frequently do we do it? And if we sit in that space longer, how would that change our approach? And if for nothing else, just to appreciate the challenge in a more realistic way. One of my wrap-up questions, we're coming up to our time here, was to ask for your advice to listeners and specifically to leaders, people in businesses or organizations that want to take the step to transform their business. This was one great one. Constança, thank you. Do you have others that you'd like to share? Open to both of you.
Well, I would add another one, which is, especially for leadership, I think there's also this myth still of a hero's journey. And what we're talking about here is not a hero's journey. It is a collective journey that we all need to participate in. So I would say that it might start with an individual impulse, right? And especially leaders and companies, organizations have a very specific role. So listen to that calling, and then we know deep down when things need to change. So listen to that calling, but really see this process as something. What is the maybe the smallest whole, maybe the smallest way of looking at it, at this change process that is not about you and then having others control, manage, whatever, then come back, right? And what regenerative development teaches us actually, which is very helpful, and it's you need to see at least 3 nested levels. So look at yourself as a leader. Yeah, what is the change that you have to go through? But then also have a team as diverse as possible from your organization. And the work that you're doing in the world. So always consider at least those 3 levels of work, of relationship. That's the journey that you need to go on through. And you can start small. It's not like the whole, organization and the whole sector that you're going to change, and the whole range of products and services. Just really try to bring those 3 levels together as a whole as you're going through this change process. And maybe then out of that, your role as a leader will be not to direct and control and say yes or no. Going back to that humbleness is more like always creating the conditions that allow this unfolding of this little microsystem that's kind of exploring how to transform. And those conditions can be from, making sure people have the right time to do things, to listen, to have the right system of learning and adaptation, that's to challenge. So just these conditions that allow life to emerge and to be more adaptive. That's what's coming up to me.
Yeah,
great.
Wonderful, Constança. There's definitely something around, Otto Sharma calls it the big blind spot of leadership, that we often look at leadership just for what they are doing out there in the world, or what is visible from their work, and actually we rarely look at what are the inner conditions that can allow to generate that kind of way of doing things. So I guess one of the things leaders should be looking at is really finding an alignment and balance between what they want to bring to the world, what is really important for them, what is their being state, like what is their inner conditions, that are levels of energy, the different conditions that are sustaining them, so that then they can show up and interact with people in a certain way. And that's very important because, as Constança was saying, we don't live in a world anymore that one leader will show us the way. Even in Buddhism, people are talking about that the next Buddha is going to be community, not one single individual. There's that kind of ideas, narratives going around also there. So I guess we live in the big shift. One of the things is how we can have ways to relate and structures and systems in place that allows the system to see itself, so allows an organization to have a sense of itself in relationship with the world around, and be able to be more adaptive and more capable of moving with the growing complexity around. And that requires that everybody steps up and have more conscience about their role within the organizations. So it cannot continue to be a top-down, very hierarchical structure. We need to change dramatically that kind of things. Not to be totally flat also. There's going to be people in different roles and functions, different things, but how we can harmonize more this inner and outer, inner individual outer and inner organization outer in a balanced way that can really sustain a developmental path for an organization that is ongoing learning, stimulating learning with their peers, including the CEOs. The CEOs can't expect an organization to evolve if they are not willing to continue to develop themselves. So there's something about creating the conditions for what Peter Singer called the learning organizations. For the last 30 years, we've been talking about that. So let's bring it to life. What it means to have a living organization that is conducive to learning, ongoing learning and development in all their different parts. And as a society, we need to be that way also.
Great. Yeah, excellent advice and insights. Thank you both. I also want to ask you, what on your journey from earliest childhood up until now stands out as moments or experiences of inspiration? It can be related to your work in regeneration, or it can be anything, but just what are some of the great memories that have sparked inspiration for you?
Well, maybe it's because I saw on Facebook yesterday a memory 8 years ago that's more alive in me. But I crossed the Atlantic sailing with 13 other women, and 3 weeks together, and we didn't know each other. And the way that it's been most inspirational is because of how there is so many judgment, even coming from women against other women, how we came together as a female group, but how our roles, it was such a beautiful shared leadership, organizational collective that was going through a lot in a very uncertain, very dramatically changing environment, and life-threatening in the end, because as soon as you get out there, then there's no one to rescue you, and they won't get on time if it's something really urgent. And we just came beautifully together, and it was such a bliss of also, so it's a human experience, was a bliss it wasn't always super nice, but it was a bliss, just to go through all of that together, and in total communion with nature and with the ocean and with the birds and with the clouds and with the wind. So it was just, for me, it was just like the most, and it contained like 3 weeks, so it was just very intense, but beginning, end, and it just, I still carry it today, even if I don't have a Facebook memory that tells me that. So that's the one I'm carrying today.
That sounds like a beautiful experience. Thank you.
So the couple of things. One is actually nature, because a few years ago, back in 2007, I made a big trip. I went to work in Uruguay, and I made a big road trip around South America. And I remember the first place I went was Patagonia. And I remember to be in front of Perito Moreno, which is one of the most scenic glaciers you can witness, because it just comes in front. You are witnessing it coming in the lake, in the lake in front of you, like this massive, huge 30-meter walls. And I remember to sit there alone, because a big part of this trip was done alone. And having this sense of impermanence, that this is going to, my kids, whenever I'm going to have kids or my next generations are not going to see this. So there's a profound pain in that. And also at the same time, a profound sense of beauty and of acknowledging that, this doesn't make sense if I'm experiencing this just by myself. So that moment there alone in front of the Perito Moreno for me was a kind of a renewal of commitment and my sensibility towards recognizing that life is being with each other. There is no that this kind of collecting experiences kind of way of looking at life today from a very individualistic perspective is not really fulfilling. And if I add that to a sense of there's a very beautiful movie that often Constança and I talk about called Humans. It's a 3 parts movie. It's just interviews with the black scenario and faces of people talking about different aspects of life, love, death. And there's an interview on the first movie. You can watch this on YouTube. It's available. There's an interview of a guy that is on the death row in the States. He's accused of killing, a family, a mother and the child when he was 20 something. He was a very young guy. And he's talking about when his father used to beat him when he was a kid. He always no violence for him. Love was about, a way to express love was to make others' lives miserable, beat them, whatever. So he would always hurt even people he would love. So he ends up killing this woman and her baby, and is in prison waiting for death penalty. And a woman starts to write to him, and he starts to cry, telling about that woman that actually shifted the way he thought about love. And actually, the woman was the grandmother of the kid and mother of the woman that was killed, which started to write him just to understand him, to understand where he had to go to do such a hedonous crime, And by engaging in that conversation with him, she was able to understand him, to in a way apologize. Well, you could never apologize, but at least to reconcile that and allow him to understand what love really is. And that moment was so strong for me, because even in these extreme cases, human beings are able to, when there's a different way to come in, to generate all sorts of unexpected results. So that filled me with a lot of deep appreciation, care, and hope for the humankind. We have what it takes to do this. But we need to support each other, be humble, and acknowledge our shortcomings. It's very easy to get contracted in your own preservation kind of coping mechanisms that then end up, generating results nobody of us wants to generate in the world. So let's all support each other and be humble and try to do the best we can every day.
Beautiful story. Thank you for sharing. The final question I want to ask for both of you is, in your work and in the field of regeneration, sustainability, whatever frame different people are using, where do you see the most hope? Where have you found areas that give you hope?
Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily my field. I'm sensing into that the capacity of humans to change and to do it very quickly if needed. And I think this is in the end my deep inquiry always. And just these social media movements that we have seen that really go against the deep systemic inequalities or injustices. So from Black Lives Matters in the middle of the pandemic, when humanity was going through God knows what, the Fridays for Future with all the youth, saying it's enough. We want to, you adults don't know what you're doing, but they came together and they just, and amplify their voice, and they organized so fast to now the latest movement around the movement from Iran against the hijab, and the amount of the courage to face that and to go against things that will end up in a life-threatening event, but still sharing and all that kind of effects it's having on so many people. You might say that might not lead to change, but the fact that people are coming together, are using these tools that are also reason for other unintended consequences that are not very helpful. There's just so much impulse for us to wanting to be better. And that really gives me a lot of hope.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing. There's so much things going on. So yeah, I would say, not putting names, but there's just a word for all the pioneers that are out there, just doing a lot of work. Often, many of them with a lot of effort and a lot of pain in kind of trying to explore new pathways. To all those who are, in between, inside the system, doing what they can to auspice the pain that is in each system, and trying to do some leverage and change wherever they can, but still, in dialogue with surrounding the margins, as Constança is saying. There's so much going on. And I also think there's a lot of promising, a lot of hope in spaces where people start to converge, kind of these nodal points. Either it's a land or a community in somewhere, and there's plenty of people converging in that sense, but also converging on a more global scale, also around regeneration and learning with each other, what it means to regenerate ourselves, our cultures, and the land around us. Because often regeneration is taught in terms of just regenerating the land, and I do appreciate and admire people who are able to commit their lives to one specific land and be there all the time. It takes a lot to be on an ongoing basis in your place, committing energy and you're renewing your will to to regenerate that place. So there's plenty of spaces to find hope and find exciting things to do. Unfortunately, most of them you'll not find them on the news, so go and look around. But there's plenty of people everywhere at this moment doing things and often in the margins. So I would say, don't look at the centers of power for the really interesting things. Look at the margins and look at the spaces in between, and you'll find there's a lot of promising stuff going on, and a lot of promising relationships starting to be nurtured, which is where a lot of changes can come from.
That's great. Look to the margins, have hope and faith in the capacity of the human spirit to adapt and be resilient, flirt with the potential, find your essence. These are some of the themes bubbling up for me right now. This was such a fun conversation. Thanks again, both of you, for joining me and sharing your story. And I'm really excited to see the next chapters of Lúcida and the work that comes, and continue to have these dancing in the complexity moments together and sharing good company along the journey. Thank you both so much for joining.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you for the energy. This is a beautiful space as well.
Thank you.